Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, what would the Buddha say to somebody who does not feel themselves like a man or a woman? Or who was born a man but feels like a woman, or vice versa?
I suppose the Buddha might say that just like right and wrong, and good and bad, man and woman is a duality that must be overcome through realizing the truth of emptiness.
But the Buddha himself is a man, and all other Buddhas are men.
This is quite true. It is not a distortion of the teaching. Although the Dharma holds true no matter what sex or gender a person is, the Buddha teaches us that one must be reborn in a male body before they can attain ultimate Buddhahood. Buddhism, I think, has a problem here.
How can followers of the Buddha solve this problem?
I suppose they must solve it through realizing the truth of emptiness of gender, of sex, and of identity.
Were they as enlightened as they say, it would not be so difficult.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing how Buddhism deals with gender and sex. How does gender function in Buddhism? What is the doctrinal basis for this function? How has this function changed over time? I hope you enjoy.
So, how does gender function in Buddhism?
Well, I'll start this by saying that gender and sex in Buddhist doctrine, let alone all of the pop culture that Buddhism has had an influence on for over the last 2,000 years in East Asia, this is a very hot field of academic study, and I'll do my very best to give the highlights. There's a lot of issues and a lot of voices on this issue to offer to the field of scholarship of Buddhism. So let's dive in as much as we can in one episode. So many early Buddhist traditions and many Mahāyāna traditions have a problem. They hold that the Buddha, or in the case of later Mahāyāna, a Buddha, possesses 32 marks of a great man, or the Mahapurusa Lakshana. One of these is a sheathed penis, which is a gendered mark. Therefore, only a person with the body of a man can be a Buddha. Furthermore, the Buddha preaches on this topic in the Vinaya texts. Vinaya texts are texts which serve solely as instructions to the monks. So these are not texts for laity, necessarily. They're texts for high-level disciples who have renounced the householding life to study the sutras and cultivate enlightenment. These texts outline the rules that these monks and nuns of Buddhism must follow in their daily lives. And they typically hold that men and women are to stay separated in their mindfulness in order to prevent temptation and sexual indiscretions. So monks and nuns will often not even live on the same monastery grounds, or if they do, they'll be on opposite ends. In addition to that, these texts outline rules for one's daily lifestyle as a monk or a nun. The men have only 227 rules by most accounts, while the women have 311. That is a very gendered, very significant gap. The extra 80 rules for women all have to do with the fact that they're thought of as being evil temptresses that will try and tempt men out of their mindfulness to go have sex with them. As you can see, this is a very sexist opinion of women. They are also thought of as being impure because they menstruate, and they are thought of as being less able to put the teaching into practice because of their feminine nature, I suppose. There's never really a good explanation given for why the Vinaya texts treat women so much more harshly. There's never a good reasoned out explanation, but I guess at the same time, there's never a good reasoned out explanation for sexism in the first place. Finally, women in Buddhism are said to possess the 5 obstacles, including being incapable of becoming a Brahma king, a Shakra, a Mara king, a Chakravartin, or a Buddha. These characters are all important male figures in Brahmanism or Buddhist cosmology. So, essentially, the idea is that because they are women, they cannot become these characters which are men. And so it's kind of circular reasoning. Because they're women, they can't not be women. So you can see that it's reinforcing and replicating a sexist point of view. Now, there's a contradiction between all of this and some other important concepts in Buddhism that we've already discussed. One important point is that there's a bodhisattva, the most popular in all of East Asia, whose gender is ambiguous. That bodhisattva is Avalokiteshvara, who is known as Guanyin in China and Kannon in Japan. Most early Indian representations of Avalokiteshvara depict him as a man, but then those change in China, where she becomes the female Guanyin, and she becomes equated with the Mother Mary by a lot of Western scholars. This gets even more complicated in Japan, where Guanyin becomes Kannon and becomes essentially genderless. Why is that important? Because it refers to a very important point about bodhisattvas and about Buddhas both. They can arise and appear in the world in any form, including that of a man, a woman, a genderless person, a Buddha, animals, demons, what have you, in order to fulfill their bodhisattva vows and save all sentient beings. If they can appear in the world as a Buddha, then they must already possess Buddhahood, right? And if they possess Buddhahood and can appear as a woman or a genderless person in the world, that must mean that gender or sexual characteristics do not factor into Buddhahood. One would think so based on this alone, but based on the sutras, we find that sexual characteristics do still have a significant part to play in Buddhist doctrine.
What is the doctrinal basis for the status of women in Buddhism?
I personally don't think there is one, but for me to have that opinion, I have to prioritize one teaching and ignore or explain away another. I have to personally prioritize emptiness and non-duality as it applies to gender. Meaning I have to rely solely on the teaching that dualities, such as good, bad, up, down, man, and woman, are meaningless or relative, and I have to emphasize overcoming those things as a means of attaining understanding, attaining enlightenment. And I have to prioritize that over the teaching of the 32 physical marks and other points like in the Vinaya texts where the hindrances to Buddhahood that women possess are explained upon. Furthermore, I have to come up with some way to explain the contradiction between these two teachings. One way that this contradiction gets explained often in Mahāyāna Buddhism is through the teaching of upaya, or expedient means. This teaching holds that sometimes the Buddha says things not because they are all 100% capital T true, but because they're meant to lead one to the truth. Therefore, it's my opinion that sexism in the sermons of the Buddha is there because sexism was in the hearts and minds of early Buddhists, influenced by Brahmanical traditions, influenced by other cultural trends. And in this enlightened use of skillful means, the Buddha was meeting them where they were at. That's essentially the essence of upaya, is meeting somebody where they're at so that you can get them to somewhere where they're not, but where you believe they want to be. However, you can see that there's a lot of apologetics and a lot of mental gymnastics going on here. I accept and acknowledge that, at the end of the day, Buddhism has a problem with sexism and misogyny. For those Buddhists that do genuinely think there is a doctrinal basis for this gender status, they simply say that it is still possible for a woman to attain really good karma and to reach high levels of attainment, and to make their karma good enough that they may be born in the body of a man, and therefore this is a non-issue. You can see that this just kind of paves over the issue and says to women, sorry, you should just be born a man next time.
It also says, sorry, you are of it puts womanhood as a lesser karmic place. Like, yes. That sucks. That really sucks.
It argues, in fact, that if you have bad enough karma, then you'll be reborn as a woman.
Yeah, all of that sucks really bad. This is just a spot where it looks like the source material is rancid.
It absolutely is. And trying to evaluate it and critique it and come to an understanding about it in our modern day time period where we're trying to reconcile it with different views about gender that we have now, it gets so complicated and weedy, and it's difficult because you don't want to slander any of the teachings necessarily. You don't want to go against these teachings and transform Buddhism into something that it's not, right? That's an issue that we have with Buddhist modernism.
Right.
And similarly, you don't want to belittle one teaching over another because it's earlier or because it's later, because then you're belittling either the Mahāyāna school or the Theravada schools. which emphasize earlier versus later teachings. So in order to accept and understand this, you kind of really have to do a lot of erasure of Buddhist doctrine and oftentimes Buddhist ritual.
Yeah, it's a real shame because its own text contradicts itself here. Gender is the most dual of the dualities that I could name at the moment. Like, it's non-duality completely tears these kinds of things apart.
Exactly. And it seems like it would be a very easy target as well, because the Brahmanical traditions and Buddhism as well are both making moral dual arguments that this and that is good and this and that is bad. And so it's very difficult to sell somebody the belief in non-duality based on an understanding of good and bad. Because if you do that, then you're actually easily going to fall into the trap of relativism, moral relativism. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that if you say, okay, there is no such thing as black and white, there is only gray area, then what you could be misunderstood to be saying is there is no absolute good or absolute bad. There's only relative or circumstantial morality. And that's a much more difficult sell than to say attainment has nothing to do with what's in your pants. That's a very simple, easy, true statement. And it makes no difference to any of the other doctrines, right? It doesn't contradict any of the other doctrines. So it's curious to me why this discussion of man and woman as being absolutes, but good and bad are not absolutes. It seems like it's going around the elbow to get to the back end, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just a shame, I guess. Buddhism is not alone in this problem, but at least in the West, it's a problem that's very much paved over. Mm-hmm. I had to go looking for that kind of doctrine to encounter it. Like, it doesn't really get brought up in the books.
Exactly, yes. And that, as we have discussed with Buddhist modernism, is a result of East Asian Buddhist thinkers trying to repackage Buddhism as something that Westerners would be likely to dabble with. So they have to ignore and erase these doctrines and other ones which were not fitting well with very early feminist ideas that were arising in the West. And to that end, like I said before, it has made Buddhism into something that it's not. I have no way to explain this and no apologetics for this other than to say that Buddhism does genuinely have a problem here. And it does shake out in rituals. It does shake out in how Buddhism is practiced, even in a monastic sense today. There's still separated male housing and female housing on monasteries, and there's still 200 and something rules for the men and 300 something rules for the women. There's been no effort to change this narrative, to change this doctrine, to go back over it and reappraise it, reevaluate it for an egalitarian modern time period. And it's a true shame.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a bit about how this changes. So how does the Buddhist idea of gender change over time in the scriptures?
There are some scriptures in later Mahāyāna Buddhism that challenge and problematize these earlier doctrines about sex and gender, but they only do so a little bit. They don't go so far as we might like them to. So what comes to mind for me are 3 scenes in 3 different sutras, which are fairly transformative for the status of women in Buddhism. The first is in the Diamond Sutra, which we will read and discuss at a later date, where the Buddha tells his interlocutor Subhuti that the 32 physical marks are themselves empty and should be understood as such. That means that having a penis is suddenly less important to Buddhism, because gendered characteristics are empty, like everything else. Next is in the Vimalakirti Sutra. There is a very well-known scene in chapter 6 where a very high-level disciple called Shariputra, who typically serves as a stand-in for the earlier teachings in the Mahāyāna Sutras, enters a battle of wits and wisdom with a goddess, and he loses when she uses her supernatural powers to switch bodies with him for a short time to demonstrate the non-duality of gender. The final transformative scene is in the Lotus Sutra. In the Devadatta chapter of the Lotus Sutra, there is another scene between Shariputra and a powerful Buddhist woman. In this scene, there's an 8-year-old dragon princess who the Bodhisattva Manjushri claims to Shariputra can attain Buddhahood, like right now. And Shariputra says, no, women, animals, children, they can't do it. They can't attain Buddhahood. And the dragon princess girl then makes an offering to the Buddha and instantly transforms herself into a male bodhisattva and attains Buddhahood on the spot. These are just some of the scenes that are pretty transformative for women in the more popular sutras. There's many others, and I hope that we have the chance to read and discuss those sutras and those scenes, because I think that in this day and age, it does us more good to emphasize and discuss and unpack those scenes than it does to critique and lament the scenes where women are subordinated to men. However, all of that said, even with these famous scenes in the sutras where sexist Shariputra gets gobsmacked by powerful women, the scriptures still stick to the original teaching that one must have the body of a man to become a Buddha. As you saw, all of these characters had to transform into men, or they transformed into men to demonstrate something, or their powers stemmed from not being human women. They were all either goddesses or dragons, and so it's very contentious. It's very contentious. So the problem improved over the course of different sutras, but it definitely didn't go away, and it has not gone away since.
How do we put a bow on this topic? Because it's just, even when we have scripture that's trying to move away from requiring a male body, it goes right back to it at the end. Even when they're trying, it doesn't come out looking very good to me.
I do want to mention and add that part of the contradiction and part of the issue that we're facing has to do with an abiding desire to make the early teachings and the late teachings all be of the same status, all be 100% absolute capital T truth, because they came from the Buddha's mouth, and they ignore the possibility that there was any change or shift in the narrative over time, even though it's clear that there was. And so that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that Buddhism held aside, East Asian cultures have been sexist for thousands of years, just like Western cultures have. So regardless of the shift in narrative, regardless of the more progressive teachings, or even regardless of the more progressive schools of Buddhism, sexism is a problem that's very much independent from Buddhism, and also unfortunately has a strong influence on how Buddhism is carried out. And so there's a lot of difficulty with how to separate Buddhist practice in the modern era, especially as an East Asian monastic person, and sexism, how to separate it from those doctrines. So this is an issue that I would say is ongoing, and it's very difficult to find a resolution for, because there is no effort going on to really change this. Maybe a teaching will be de-emphasized at one time or emphasized at another, but overall, I think that this is one of the problems of organized religion. This is one of the problems of trying to come to a conclusive, comprehensive perspective and understanding on what it means to be a man or a woman. And it's an inability to see past the most human duality that we can possibly encounter in our lives. And so I think it's difficult, very difficult. And it's a shame that these problems exist in the doctrine, because there's so many other really fantastic teachings that I think are really transformative for people's daily lives.
I agree on that last point, I suppose. And this is just a weakness in the religion, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it doesn't make it okay, but like you said earlier, it's not alone. I mean, you're hard-pressed to find a truly egalitarian, organized, popular religion.
Yeah. Well, on that somewhat downer note, let's talk about next time. So, next week, we're going to do another deep dive on a term. This time, it is the term bodhisattva. What is a bodhisattva? What are the different meanings of this word? How do these meanings change over time? We hope to see you next week, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for listening. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Our email is bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com.
You can find us on Twitter at Bright Buddhism.
As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.